We welcome Jenin Younes back to the Schilling Show, attorney with the New Civil Liberties Alliance. George Mason University vaccine mandate update. Jenin, welcome back to the Schilling Show. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me back.
All right, so very interesting. They had a policy at George Mason University, their reopening policy. Would you tell us briefly what it is? Then we're going to get into the details here about this professor.
Sure, yeah. So the reopening policy required all employees to get the COVID vaccine or unless they could get a religious or medical exemption. And if they did not get the vaccine, then they were subject to disciplinary action, including termination of employment.
Wow, so that's very draconian. You got involved how?
I got involved. Professor Zywicki actually contacted me. I think he had heard that I was had gone to an organization called the New Civil Liberties Alliance in Washington, D.C., in part because I had hoped to fight vaccine mandates.
So he contacted you, and you got involved. Yeah. Let's talk about the steps that you took initially, because he had concern. He'd actually had COVID and had antibodies and natural immunity, correct? Yeah,
he actually had very high antibody levels. This wasn't speculative. He had had COVID in March of 2020, and he had repeatedly gotten tested. Actually, he'd given blood at the American Red Cross on a number of occasions, and they tested for antibodies. And then more recently, in June of 2021, he got a test that showed very high protection.
All right, so he was able to show that information, and George Mason University, in response, said what?
So they said they do not grant exemptions based on natural immunity. Professor Zywicki then applied for an exemption on our advice based on he had a different medical situation, and so we asked for an exemption based on either grounds, natural immunity or the other grounds. They granted that exemption. We do not believe that the other grounds were the real reason. Frankly, the evidence to substantiate it was not good.
Yeah. We're talking with Jenin Younes, attorney with the New Civil Liberties Alliance, on what's going on at George Mason University. And just kind of on a side note, an attorney who's represented me on a number of issues, Matt Harden, I understand, was involved in this case as well. Did he help you out in all of this?
Matt Harden was helped serving as local counsel. He didn't really wasn't part of the substantive briefing.
So let's talk about what's going on right now, because I want to ask you if this exemption is conditional.
Conditional how?
Well, are there any conditions? In other words, is he free to just attend, or does he have to submit to some other criteria?
So he's not treated exactly like a vaccinated person, which much to my chagrin. George Mason has not recognized natural immunity. In fact, they continue to maintain that there's no such thing as natural immunity. They made that statement to me. But one of the reasons, that made it difficult for us to decide whether to continue with the lawsuit or not. But one of the reasons we decided this would be an acceptable resolution was that George Mason is actually bringing so many restrictions back for everybody that Professor Zywicki is no longer sort of being stigmatized. So, for instance, initially they said he'd have to wear a mask if he got this exemption and nobody else would, but now they brought back masks for everybody. So, we weren't sure. At first it looked as though social distancing might mean he couldn't hold office hours, he couldn't attend events or conferences. They said that that's not what this would entail. He will be able to go to anything that he wants to go to, hold office hours. He just has to maintain 6 feet of distance. And then with respect to testing, he has to get tested once a week, but they agreed that it would be on their campus at their cost, not his cost, and it would not be the invasive nasal swab, but the saliva test. So we thought those terms were okay. So it looks like George Mason is also requiring all students now to get tested weekly, vaccinated or not. I think unvaccinated is actually twice weekly. So,
So is this applicable to other people, this exemption that he had? Are there other people in the same boat there, and could you apply this to them?
So What I can say is that the exemption was granted ostensibly because Professor Zywicki had shingles. That was in his doctor's declaration. The declaration was about 10 or so pages long, explaining why his natural immunity made the vaccine risky for him. There was one and it had tons of studies, scientific studies. We had one paragraph saying, and the shingles thing causes a concern too. No studies to back it up. So, I think their claim that this was about the shingles, I find very suspect. And so I think maybe the takeaway is universities don't really want to deal with lawsuits. So,
right.
Just the prospect of having to might mean, there's a motivation to give people exemptions. And the doctor also made the point that, almost everybody's had chicken pox. You could make the same argument. Well, the vaccine could reactivate the chicken pox. I mean, so we don't believe that's why this exemption was granted.
Jenin, Younes, if people would like to follow your work at the New Civil Liberties Alliance to get more information on this particular case, how can they do that?
You can go to nclalegal.org. That's our website. You can also follow me on Twitter. I tweet a lot about what I'm working on.
Terrific. Jenin, Younes, thank you so much for the update, and we'll continue to follow this case.
Thank you so much.